How to create a solid sense of self. That's the topic for this video. This is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. So if you've been following this channel or my work for some time, you know that I tend to spend a lot of time talking about how there really is no such thing as a self, how the self is an illusion of sorts. And this is also a big part of the psychological illusion model that I teach, and which is the fundamental framework I use in seeing clients. I've been asked by quite a few people on multiple occasions, might it be useful sometimes to actually deliberately help someone to create a solid sense of self? A sense of self that's psychologically oriented, that seems stable, permanent, and autonomous. I'm going to be talking a little bit about how you might do that and also some arguments for and against doing this very thing. So here's some arguments for, I think. So if we look at people whose personality styles fit what's called the cluster B personality disorders. You know, people who might be quite high in narcissistic tendencies, or quite high in borderline personality tendencies, or histrionic, or people who have strong psychopathic tendencies. What you will see as a kind of red thread or common denominator with these folks is that they haven't really developed a psychological, stable sense of self over time. So it kind of makes sense then to wonder, well, what would happen if they could do that? Also, if you look at what I think has been done right in the Western world, you see, in the Western world, we have this tendency to orient to the individual, that the individual actually has rights. So if you look at the Western world and our civilization, you know, where freedom of speech is the mother of all freedoms, accomplishments such as freedom of speech, rule of law, universal human rights, property rights, this all presupposes an individual self and orients these rights around said self. And if someone's going to be functional in such a society, if you look at what we call democracy, I would argue that it's not really a democracy, and we don't really have these things, but we kind of have them to at least to some extent. Well, a democracy then presupposes a person who has his or her own judgment, who can take a step back from his own cultural surround and have his own take on things. So that kind of presupposes a psychological, stable sense of self. And if you look at developmental psychology, if you look at something like Robert Kegan's model of adult psychology, or the research of Jane Lovinger and Susanne Cook-Greuter in terms of ego development, or the work of Claire Graves, popularized under the spiral dynamics banner by Christopher Coven and Don Beck, even though these models are similar, they do tend to point to, they're similar and different, right? They do tend to point to this tendency of us humans to be born rather undifferentiated, right? It's just sensory experience. There's no sense of a psychological self. But then as we develop, we begin to make distinctions. We begin to construct a psychological self. At least many people do. Most people actually don't get here. but we begin to develop a psychological sense of self where what Jean Piaget called formal operations is at its peak. A maximum separation between subject and object, a sense of self that's psychologically oriented, stable, independent, autonomous, characterized by good, clean boundaries between subject and object. There's a sense of self in here, usually behind the eyes, which is separate from a world out there. And also a sense of continuity over time. You know, I've had a past, and I'm moving into a future. So, this ability to construct a psychological sense of self, one's own identity, with clear, distinct boundaries and a sense of continuity over time, is essentially what is conceptualized as a mature adult in the Western world. And it is a psychological requirement to function in the modern world and to function in something which is supposed to be and marketed as, at least, a democracy. And to really be able to think in a principled way, you know, so these are some good arguments. Now, if we look at a psychological adult, or someone you would consider to be grown up and to have their shit together, so to speak, well, what are some of the characteristics that we attribute to that? Well, clear boundaries being one. The capacity to do what you could call good I-U sorting, the ability to make distinctions between my inner experience, my values, my thoughts, my beliefs, what I'm concerned with, and your inner world. That you are distinct from me in the sense that you have your own inner life of hopes and fears and dreams and values and aspirations, and the ability to make good, solid distinctions between my experience and your experience. That's required to have clear, healthy boundaries. Also, the ability to really respect and acknowledge an other, to see someone as distinct. You might see someone as interdependent, as part of the same process of life, but to see someone else as distinct, meaning, in a romantic relationship or a good friendship, to not just see other people as extensions of oneself, to be able to see that you're dealing with a human being who, not just through your own egocentricity, not just through your own kind of immediate needs and wants and desires, because if you do that, then you tend to objectify people and see them as tools, as someone who can either provide and be useful or who gets in the way. But the capacity to see that this is a person who has their own inner life and value independent of my own egocentricity or my own group affiliation. You know, to you kind of have to be able to do that and to think that way for individual rights and freedom of speech and principled thinking and rule of law and stuff like that to really even make sense. To be a good romantic partner then to another psychological adult, it probably requires a capacity to really see another person as someone who also has their own inner life, and to be able to respect that, be with that, and to acknowledge that. Well, if you're going to do that with someone else and not just see them as part of a group, or not just see them as an extension of you, or through a filter of your own immediate needs and wants and desires, then you kind of have to gain access to your own inner subjectivity and become psychologically oriented, to be able to see a sense of self then separate from others. So again, to be able to see others as distinct, to be able to have clear boundaries between one's own experience and other people's experience, it makes sense to develop a sense of self when it comes to these things. This is what we kind of associate with being an adult, and also that continuity over time, right? That goes into things such as being able to be psychologically responsible, to take responsibility for one's own actions and behaviors and intentions and one's own meaning making, to be able to see that value is not inherent in objects and stuff going on, but it's something that I kind of attribute to those things. You might need to create or construct a sense of self to be able to do these things. Because if you look at people who operate at early stages of psychological development, where the orientation is very egocentric, it's all about my immediate needs and wants and desires, they have a tendency to not quite be able to take personal responsibility. They blame others. It's always someone else's fault. He or she made me do it. I got with the wrong crowd. They don't have that sense they have a sense of self, but they don't really have a psychological sense of self, a sense of continuity over time. And that seems to be a prerequisite to what we call personal responsibility, at least the way that it's practiced by an adult. Personal responsibility, not just in following rules and norms set out by society, but to be able to take a step back and use your own mind to evaluate these things and create for for yourself what type of parent you want to be, or what type of leader, or what values you should live your life according to, right? So the ability to take responsibility in that way seems to depend upon your capacity to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously. What I want now and what I might want in the future, experienced internally at the same time. That also seems to kind of implicate or require a psychological sense of self. Um, Now, having said that, um, this might also be a mistake of sorts. I mean, the argument very often is that even in spiritual circles sometimes, that you have to be someone before you can be no one, and that it might be quite detrimental if the natural trajectory for us humans is to gradually construct a sense of self, knowing that most adults haven't really done that. Well, to then begin to talk about no self, or there being no such thing as a self, and to begin to deconstruct that and see that as illusory, might then be very counterproductive if you are trying to help someone who hasn't quite constructed those things to begin with. Now, on the flip side, though, at least to me, and this is going to sound like a paradox, or even like a contradiction, but it's not when I say to me, it's very clear to me that there is no such thing as a self. There is no Jurgen in here who's running the show. There is no thinker behind the thoughts, or decider behind the decisions, or witness behind the experience, or anything like that. It's extremely clear to me that this is a complete illusion. Uh, it's largely the result of not quite seeing thoughts as thoughts. Um, and it's really clear that the I thoughts, or the sense of self, does not create any of these things, right? So it's kind of tongue in cheek when I say construct a self, or anything like that. But might it be, as Noam Chomsky often says, a necessary illusion to kind of build and create? At least this is what seems to be the natural human trajectory. Of course, that in of itself doesn't necessarily mean that it's necessary. So I have to admit and say that it makes sense to me on some level that you might have to construct this illusion to be able to develop clear boundaries and to really see another and to really have your own take on things. But simultaneously, there is no self who's doing these things either. So whether it's really necessary or not, I have to admit I don't really know. But in my work with clients, you can talk about at least three different types of self that are quite common, that you'll quite commonly meet in society, right? So one type of self, or selfing, is the very egocentric me, what's in it for me type selfing, where the person is kind of fused with their own immediate wants and desires. It's a sense of self. They might have a strong sense of self, but it's not really a psychological sense, right? A psychological sense of self. Then you could have what's more called a socialized self, or more like a group self, where someone identifies with a group or a nation or a religion or environmental movement or a sports team or multiple, groups, and they kind of become socialized in that they become members of society. Society, or parts of society, become part of them, and they become part of society, right? That's a different type of selfing. And then you have what's called a more self-authored mind, to use Keegan's terminology, Robert Keegan, which is that kind of continuity of self over time and maximum separation between subject and object. Piaget's full formal operations. Strong boundaries, a sense of responsibility over time. That's a different type of self. So how might you develop these things? Well, remember that language, we humans think. And even that's kind of illusory, because thought itself is the thinker, meaning thinking just occurs. There's no person who's doing it really. So that's also kind of tongue in cheek. But when you walk around in the world, it probably seems to you as if you live in a world, which consists of a multiplicity of separate objects appearing to a separate subject, which is you, right? It's going to look that way for almost all of us. Now, this is entirely a thought construct. And we think in categories. And what thinking does is that it creates categories and concepts and distinctions, finer distinctions, finer nuances. And this is useful. These are very useful tools in a sense. So to build that sense of self, we need a good vocabulary, we need distinctions, we need nuances. So, one way to build a self is to just begin to act as if, right? So, there's some social psychology research written about in Timothy Wilson's excellent book Redirects, which shows that most social programs actually don't work and they're a waste of money, but there are some of them who do. And one of them, for example, was community service to, re- to reduce teen pregnancies and teen crime, right? And as part of these programs, you would take teenagers and young people who were quite egocentric and who often felt that they were, not part of something, and you get them to behave as if they are. Like they behave over time as if they care about some other people and are part of society, right? And the mind, of course, watches that and changes its narrative about who and what you are as a result of how you behave. And this actually worked quite often because what would happen then when people behaved as if they were part of society and society was part of them and as if they cared was that their inner identity would change in accordance with their behavior. You very often see this when people become member of the military or a sports team or a particular profession or a particular religion or political ideology. So becoming part of something, acting, believing as if you care, becoming absorbed in that, and internalizing the views of others is a great way for most people then to develop that more socialized form of mind. And that kind of implies that if you're dealing with someone who operates from a more egocentric stage, then having excessive emphasis on perhaps what they think and what they want and their own inner voice might be anti-developmental. The next step for them is to go from like me against the world to a more kind of ethnocentric or group oriented way of of being in the world. Even though some people might also internalize an ideology or become part of a group that has a more individualistic, you know, orientation. So to then go from that more socialized form of mind to a more self-authored form of mind, that more psychological sense of self. Well, here's what I've observed over the years. So, Albert Ellis, in his Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy System, REBT, talks about a ABC model, where A is activating events, someone does something, something happens. B is your beliefs, how you interpret, how you make meaning, how you think. And C are the consequences, what you feel and what you do. Most of the time, people talk about A and C. What Ellis would do was that he would awaken people to the fact of B, meaning that between the A, the event, and the C, what you feel and what you do, there's a B, what you think and believe. So my impression is that what people do in rational emotive behavior therapy and cognitive behavior therapy and anything that's kind of constructivist in that it orients the person towards how do you think here? What meaning are you attributing to this? What story are you creating? This kind of implies that you are the interpreter. There's a you in addition to what's going on who's making meaning and making inferences. You can have, interpretations and stories that are different from what other people have or what you had previously. and you can thereby have a different experience. This, in my experience, helps to produce or create a psychological sense of self. There's a very interesting book, by the way, by a psychologist called Patrick Gogny, who's a diagnosed psychopath, essentially, or she was diagnosed with dissocial personality disorder, which is kind of the, it's not quite the same thing, but she calls herself a sociopath. I think if you want to be kind of correct about it, it would be not primary psychopathy, but secondary psychopathy. She she has a very interesting book called Sociopath, where she's a psychologist who's a secondary psychopath or sociopath. And she talks about how cognitive behavioral therapy was extremely useful for her in terms of these sorts of things. Um, Creating a relationship to her own kind of egocentricity and her own impulses and her own, quirks to want to do certain things and to be able to see a wider perspective. Um, Anything that helps people to actively think, in terms of time, to reflect on the past and to create a future. Anything that creates good distinctions between intentions and consequences and holding yourself responsible for said consequences is extremely useful, because this presupposes and kind of strengthens that sense of a continuous self over time. So anything that kind of creates an analysis between intention and consequences and encourages reflections and perhaps initially just behaving as if you are responsible. Um, Even if someone's quite egocentric, to help them develop a more socialized form of mind, you know, might initially be to just help them to see that they are not that well served by just living this hedonistic, in the moment, the future is just the past which hasn't happened yet type orientation. That they are actually better served by looking at consequences and thinking ahead and these sorts of qualities. Helping someone to not just have one perspective at a time, but to coordinate multiple perspectives simultaneously seems to encourage a psychological sense of self. Again, anything that helps people to kind of see that they are the interpreter, they are the storyteller, making distinctions between, again, my experience and your experience, making a distinction between what you're saying and what I'm hearing, to get people to check their assumptions to see that I'm making meaning, essentially. I can take a step back and decide for myself what to value, what to believe, how to use my time, what matters to me. Um, Byron Katie has a excellent kind of tool. She talks about God, or in terms of differentiating experience, she talks about God or nature's business, my business, and other people's business. So whether it snows more, tomorrow here in Norway or not, nature's business or God's business, whatever you believe. What I care about, value, and respect, my business. What you care about, value, and respect, your business, right? So one thing I train my clients to do to help them develop better I-you sorting, or clear boundaries, is to just ask the question when they get stressed, whose business am I in? Because what you'll discover a lot of the time is that you're in other people's business. Now, asking a question like that, whose business am I in, psychologically continually reinforces this distinction between my inner world and your inner world, to help people to see that the people in their life, they see what they see, they hear what they hear, they believe what they believe, they understand whatever they understand, and that what they do is to uninvited step into other people's business, create stories about what they should see, hear, and care about, and then blame other people for being the source of their misery, right? This is madness. This is the result of not having good IU sorting or clear boundaries. Uh, Again, becoming curious about how other people make meaning. Like, what do you make of this? How does this look to you? To see that other people have a different inner life than one's own, so that one can see people more as individuals in their own right. Helping someone take responsibility for what they take responsibility for. Reflecting on what am I responsible for? What is my domain? What is your domain? This is useful. Um, Helping someone take responsibility for the expectations they place on other people, their own disappointments, in the sense that it's not that other people disappoint them, it's that they create with their own mind expectations about other people that other people then don't necessarily live up to. And to hold oneself responsible for, both creating and adjusting one's own expectations so that they're functional. Um, Another really interesting tool that I often use with clients is an exercise called the hero in the story. Because we all have this inner, you know, uh, narrator in a sense that functions a bit like a press secretary or a lawyer that's constantly spinning the story to make it so that we are right or we are justified. So, a very simple writing exercise of helping someone to look at, uh, well, let's assume that the other person is the hero in the story, not me, right? How would that look like then from the hero's perspective? And who would I have to be in that story for the other person to be the hero? This is extremely difficult for people to do. People very often will write things like, well, my ex is kind of a narcissist. And I'll go, that's from your perspective. In his or her narrative, she's not or he's not the narcissist. You are, right? Something else that's useful too is, Albert Ellis's rational emotive behavior therapy again. He makes a lot of emphasis on challenging the musts, the musts, the shoulds, and the needs, to distinguish between wanting things, desiring things, and insisting that they have to be a particular way. When you help people challenge their musts and needs and shoulds, they will become less neurotic. Less neurotic. And what he also emphasizes is to make a distinction between critiquing ideas and damning an individual. Of course, he's not the only one to make this distinction, but he stresses it a lot. Same internally, you might criticize what you did or how you think, but you don't have to rate yourself as a person at all. He called this unconditional self acceptance and unconditional other acceptance. Now, the irony is, I think this creates a more functional sense of self, a stronger, more autonomous sense of self, because if you no longer so strongly fuse who you are with your behavior, then it's less of a threat to admit to mistakes and screw ups and to apologize and stuff like that. And that creates a more flexible sense of self over time, too, that's more corrective to feedback. And that makes it stronger and more resilient. So these are my offerings on this particular topic. Oh, and also to study these Western developmental model. As I've said in previous videos, I really prefer Robert Kegan's model. I think there's something to ego development and Claire Graves' work as well. But just to be able to look at those maps and to see those trajectories can help your mind to kind of kickstart the process and to work on developing those particular ways of meaning making and the things that naturally seem to be on the radar when you make meaning in such a way. So I hope this was useful. If you're curious about working with me as a client and you're curious about whether you and I could be a good match, you can contact me through provocativehypnosis.com. If you're watching this in 2025, know that I have a 2-day online psychological illusion model training coming up. That's February the 15th and 16th. You can go to ayetheranalchemy.net to find the information. I'll put a link to both provocativehypnosis.com and ayetheranalchemy.net down below. As always, thanks for listening.